Before I close up today's episode with a victim impact statement, like I usually do, wanted to say, unfortunately, tomorrow, Super Bowl Sunday, no show tomorrow. I am having, or my boyfriend is having a Super Bowl party, and I just don't know any way I can do a show with a whole party going on. Unfortunately, I don't have a studio. I just have an apartment. I think it would be a little nuts. But stay tuned to my community tab if I if I get suddenly enlightened some way I can do it. I just don't think I can right now. So I'll see you guys Monday. But before I go, I wanted to start with the first letter. And this was written on September 27th, 2019. And it begins, Dear Judge Hankinson, we, Jill Goldenzeal Goldpine and Michael Pine Goldpine, submit this joint statement in hopes that some justice will be achieved in response to his horrible and untimely death of our beloved friend and colleague, Dan Markel. Michael met Dan during their first week of college in 1991. The start of their freshman year overlapped with the start of the Jewish New Year, and Michael had the first of what were many meals and conversations with Dan. They became good friends and kindred spirits. Dan was someone who loved to talk about ideas, unafraid to share his opinions, which Dan had on every topic, but always willing to listen, engage with opposing views. Dan was the most unapologetically intellectual person either of us has ever met. Dan loved ideas, people, and above all, talking with people about ideas. He was always destined to be a professor. With his green sport coat, he already dressed the part. It was no surprise that Dan chose to run Harvard's Hillel's Committee on Religious, Social, and Ethical Thought. He led dialogue between African Americans and Jews like an engaging and fascinating academic seminar. Along with Dan's erudite ideas came incredible warmth. No matter what, you would always have a place at his table, even if he was so busy with his students that he needed you to shop for the food and make the meal. He was the kind of person who was always there for his friends. Michael and Dan spent the year after graduation in Jerusalem. Throughout the years, they stayed in touch. Coincidentally, a few years later, Jill met Dan through the Alumni Association of the Dorrit Fellowship in Israel. Happily, Jill and Michael would then see Dan annually at the Dorrit Alumni Reunion. Both of us remember fondly how Dan immediately embraced Jill, both as Michael's partner and as a budding law professor herself. Starting that weekend, from that moment Jill told Dan that she wanted to be a law professor, Dan treated her as an equal colleague. He invited her to academic talks, traded ideas with her, and advised her about joining him in the legal academy. Jill was overwhelmed by his generosity and his knowledge of the field. Even before Jill became a professor, Dan asked Jill if she would like to post on his popular professional blog, Prof Blog. Stunned and flattered by this offer from a senior colleague, Jill followed up timidly. Dan's response was to hand her the password and tell her to submit posts anytime, and followed up again by helping her to do so. This type of generosity from a senior colleague is unmatched by any other professor. Jill has encountered in more than a decade of law teaching, Jill and Michael would see Dan at least once or twice a year. We would also keep in touch via Facebook and social media. Dan continued to mentor Jill professionally, and both of us engaged with him in online debates. We had enough frequency of contact that Jill still opens Facebook reflexively, expects to see a post from Dan, and immediately feels pierced by his absence. When our first child was born and Dan came to Boston for a conference, Michael took time away from work, and Jill, on maternity leave, pushed a stroller through heaps of snow to introduce Dan to our son. Dan had recently had a son as well, and we excitedly shared photos and looked forward to them playing together. We would always pick right back up where we left off in our friendship. Given the way all of us love to talk, we never expected our conversation to end. But 5 years ago, Dan's murder ended them forever. We will never get to speak to Dan again. We will not be meeting up the next time a legal academic conference comes to town. He will not be at the next Dorrit reunion or the one after that. We will not be losing track of time while our children play in the other room. Instead, there will be silence where there should have been argument and laughter. When we found out Dan was murdered, we were in shock and could not concentrate for days. The shock was instantly palpable in our extended professional and personal circle. The phones would not stop ringing, and the emails would not stop coming as we tried to digest this horror. Our entire community needed to grieve together. To help our community begin to heal, both of us organized a gathering of Dan's friends and colleagues in Cambridge. On just days of notice, dozens of people, some of whom had not seen Dan in years, and some who came from out of town, gathered at Harvard Hillel to mourn and share memories of Dan. This commitment from his friends was yet another testament to Dan's profound effect on his world. Dan's death has profoundly affected hundreds, if not thousands of people in our personal and professional circles. There is no punishment that will make us whole. None that will bring back the many hours with Dan that have been taken from us. Any sentence for those who took his life must reflect how much Dan's voice meant to the world and what was lost for so many when it was silenced. Sincerely, Jill Goldenpine and Michael Goldenpine.